The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time that week. For 15 years, he had stood guard at the most famous palace in the world. His face a mask of stone, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Tourists snapped photos, children waved, and people tried everything imaginable to make him smile or react. But James never broke character. Never. The rules were simple and absolute. A Queen's Guard must remain motionless and silent, no matter what happens around them. They were living statues, symbols of British discipline and tradition. James had seen colleagues faint from heat exhaustion rather than break position. He had watched grown men struggle not to sneeze during 2-hour shifts. The job demanded perfection, and perfection meant becoming invisible while being the most visible person in the room. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. James noticed a small girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting alone on the palace steps. She wore a faded blue dress and clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. While her parents took endless selfies nearby, completely absorbed in their phones, the little girl just stared at James with wide, curious eyes. Most children grew bored after a few minutes of trying to make the guards react. They would pull faces, wave frantically, or dance around before losing interest. But this girl was different. She simply sat there, watching him with an intensity that made James uncomfortable. Her gaze wasn't playful or mischievous like other children. There was something sad in her eyes, something that reminded him of his own daughter back home. As the morning wore on, James found himself stealing glances at the girl when no one was looking. She hadn't moved from her spot on the steps, and her parents seemed to have forgotten she existed. They were too busy posing for their vacation photos, treating the palace like a backdrop for their social media posts. The little girl's shoulders began to slump, and James noticed her wiping her eyes when she thought no one was watching. During his brief break, James learned from a colleague that the family was from Australia, visiting London for the first time. The girl's name was Emma, and according to the overheard conversations, her parents were going through a difficult divorce. This trip was supposed to be a happy distraction, but even a 6-year-old could sense the tension between her parents. They barely spoke to each other, communicating only through sharp, whispered arguments about directions and schedules. When James returned to his post, Emma was still there. She had moved closer to his position, now sitting just a few feet away from where he stood. Her parents were arguing about something near the palace gates, their voices growing louder despite the public setting. Emma had pulled her knees up to her chest and buried her face in her stuffed rabbit. The afternoon grew warmer, and tourists came and went in waves. James maintained his perfect posture, his face showing no emotion as hundreds of people passed by. But his mind kept wandering to the little girl who seemed so alone in the crowd. He had been trained to ignore everything around him, to be immune to human emotion and drama. Yet something about Emma's quiet sadness was breaking through his professional armor. As the day progressed, James noticed other guards glancing at the situation too. His colleague, Corporal Davies, was posted nearby and had also observed the family dynamics. Through subtle eye movements and tiny gestures invisible to the public, the guards communicated their shared concern. They had all seen difficult family situations play out in front of the palace, but this felt different. This felt personal. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the palace walls. Emma's parents finally seemed ready to leave, but they were still bickering about their evening plans. The little girl stood up slowly, dusting off her dress and tucking her rabbit under her arm. She looked up at James one last time, and in that moment, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Emma raised her small hand and gave him the tiniest wave goodbye. Not the exaggerated attention-seeking waves that most tourists gave, but a genuine, gentle gesture of farewell. Her eyes held a mixture of hope and sadness, as if she was saying goodbye to the one constant, reliable presence in her confusing day. James felt his chest tighten, and for the first time in 15 years of service, he questioned whether remaining motionless was always the right choice. That night, James went home to his own family and hugged his daughter a little tighter. He couldn't stop thinking about Emma's wave, about the loneliness he had seen in her young face. The image stayed with him as he tried to sleep, challenging everything he thought he knew about duty, discipline, and what it truly meant to serve. He began to wonder if there were moments when being human was more important than being a perfect soldier, when compassion should override protocol. The next morning, as James prepared for another day of standing guard, he made a decision that would change not only his own perspective, but also influence his fellow guards in ways none of them could have imagined. The rigid rules that had defined his career were about to meet the unstoppable force of human kindness, and James was ready to see which one would prove stronger. 3 weeks after the encounter with Emma, James found himself facing another situation that would test his resolve. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman in her 80s, approached his post with a walker. She moved slowly but determinedly, her gray hair dampened by the London drizzle. Unlike the usual tourists who came for photos and excitement, Mrs. Hartwell had a different purpose. She positioned herself directly in front of James and began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. Her words were meant only for him, though dozens of people milled around nearby. She told him about her late husband, Robert, who had served as a Queen's Guard in the 1960s. Robert had passed away just 2 months ago, and Eleanor had traveled from Yorkshire to visit the place where he had worked for 3 years of his life. Eleanor's voice trembled as she described how Robert used to tell her stories about his time at the palace. He had loved the honor and responsibility of the position, but he had also struggled with the isolation it required. Robert had once confided that the hardest part wasn't standing still for hours or dealing with difficult weather. The hardest part was pretending not to care about the people around him, especially when he witnessed moments of genuine human need or sadness. As Eleanor spoke, James felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Her words echoed his own recent struggles with the rigid requirements of his role. She told him how Robert had always wondered if he had missed opportunities to make a difference in people's lives by adhering so strictly to protocol. The old man had carried that regret with him for decades, questioning whether perfect discipline was worth the cost of human connection. Eleanor reached into her small handbag and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a young man in a red tunic and bearskin hat, standing proudly at attention. The resemblance to James was striking, not in physical appearance but in the unmistakable bearing of a Queen's Guard. She held the photo up for James to see, though he couldn't acknowledge it outwardly. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered that Robert would have been proud to know that young men like James were carrying on the tradition. The rain continued to fall, and other tourists began to seek shelter under nearby awnings. But Eleanor remained in place, seemingly oblivious to the weather. She told James about Robert's final weeks, how he had expressed a desire to return to the palace one more time, but had been too weak to travel. She had promised him that she would come in his place, to see if the young guards of today still possessed the same sense of duty and honor that had defined his service. James watched as raindrops rolled down Eleanor's weathered cheeks, mixing with her tears. She was getting soaked, but she seemed determined to finish what she had come to say. She spoke about the sacrifices that military families make, how the spouses and children of servicemen and women often go unrecognized for their own contributions to duty and country. Eleanor had waited through countless lonely nights, wondering if Robert would come home safely from various postings around the world. A young couple with cameras noticed Eleanor talking to James and started taking pictures, treating her emotional moment as part of the tourist spectacle. Other visitors began to gather, some laughing and making jokes about the old woman getting drenched in the rain. James felt his jaw clench involuntarily as he watched strangers turn Eleanor's private tribute into entertainment. Eleanor seemed to sense the growing audience around her, and her voice became even quieter. She told James that Robert had always said the true test of a guard wasn't whether he could remain motionless during a ceremony or parade. The real test was whether he could maintain his humanity while upholding the highest standards of military bearing. Robert believed that the best guards were those who cared deeply about their duty, precisely because they cared deeply about people. As the crowd around them grew larger and more intrusive, James made a decision that went against every rule in his training manual. He couldn't speak to Eleanor or move from his position. but he could send her a message in the only way available to him. Very slowly and deliberately, James shifted his gaze down to meet Eleanor's eyes. For just a moment, he allowed her to see, past the ceremonial mask and glimpse the man beneath the uniform. The effect was immediate and powerful. Eleanor's face lit up with understanding and gratitude. She clutched the photograph of her late husband to her chest and whispered a soft, "Thank you," that only James could hear. In that brief exchange of looks, she had received the acknowledgement she had traveled hundreds of miles to find. She had connected with the living embodiment of the values her husband had held dear. Eleanor carefully tucked the photograph back into her handbag and adjusted her grip on the walker. Before leaving, she stood as straight as her aged frame would, and gave James a small, respectful nod. It was a gesture of recognition between two people who understood the weight of duty and the importance of honoring those who served. As she slowly made her way back through the crowd, James felt something shift inside him. The tourists gradually dispersed, disappointed that they hadn't witnessed anything more dramatic. But James remained changed by the encounter. Eleanor's words about her husband's regrets resonated deeply with his own recent questioning of rigid protocol. He began to understand that true honor might sometimes require bending the rules, that compassion and duty could coexist rather than conflict. That evening, James called his elderly father, a veteran himself, and told him about Eleanor's visit. His father listened quietly before sharing his own thoughts about the balance between military discipline and human decency. The conversation helped James realize that he wasn't betraying his oath by allowing moments of genuine human connection. Instead, he was discovering what it truly meant to serve with honor. The following month brought an incident that would become legendary among the Queen's Guards, though it would never appear in any official reports. Corporal Michael Davies had been stationed at Windsor Castle for the afternoon shift when he noticed a commotion near the public entrance. A school group of about 30 children, all wearing bright yellow safety vests, had arrived for their planned tour of the castle grounds. Among the excited children was 8-year-old Sophie Chen, who used a wheelchair due to a condition she had been born with. While her classmates ran around taking pictures and trying to get the guards' attention, Sophie remained on the outskirts of the group, unable to see over the crowd of taller children and adults. Her teacher, Ms. Patterson, was busy managing the more energetic students and hadn't noticed Sophie's growing frustration. Davies observed the situation developing throughout the afternoon. Sophie's wheelchair couldn't navigate the uneven cobblestones easily, and the positioning of the barriers meant she had no clear view of the ceremony that was about to take place. The changing of the guard was the highlight of the school trip, something the children had been learning about for weeks in their history lessons. But Sophie was going to miss it entirely due to circumstances beyond her control. The other children in the group began to gather in prime viewing spots, pressing against the barriers and chattering excitedly about the ceremony. Sophie's wheelchair was pushed further back by the crowd of adults and older students who unconsciously blocked her path. Davies watched her face fall as she realized she wouldn't be able to see anything from her position. She didn't complain or ask for help, but her disappointment was obvious to anyone paying attention. Davies found himself thinking about his younger brother, who had faced similar challenges growing up with a physical disability. He remembered countless family outings where his brother had missed out on experiences simply because the world wasn't designed with accessibility in mind. The memories stirred something protective and determined in Davies, reminding him why he had joined the military in the first place: to serve and protect those who needed it most. As the ceremony preparation began, Davies made a decision that would require perfect timing and absolute trust from his fellow guards. The changing of the guard followed a precise choreography that had been performed the same way for centuries. Every step, every movement, every gesture was planned and rehearsed. There was no room for improvisation or deviation from the established routine. But Davies had noticed something during his months at Windsor Castle. There was a brief moment during the ceremony when the guards moved from one formation to another, creating a temporary gap in their usual positions. During this transition, which lasted exactly 45 seconds, there was a space near the barriers where Sophie's wheelchair could fit, if someone could guide her there quickly and quietly. Davies caught the eye of Sergeant Williams, his commanding officer for the day. Through subtle hand signals that looked like part of the ceremonial routine, he communicated his intention. Williams initially looked skeptical, but when he spotted Sophie struggling to see from behind the crowd, his expression changed. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, indicating that he would provide cover for whatever Davies was planning. The ceremony began with its usual pomp and precision. The guards moved through their formations flawlessly, their red tunics bright against the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle. The children watched in awe as the soldiers demonstrated the discipline and coordination that had made them famous around the world. But Davies kept one eye on Sophie, waiting for his moment. When the crucial transition began, Davies did something unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard. As the formation shifted, he stepped slightly out of position and moved toward Sophie's location. The movement was so smooth and appeared so natural that most observers thought it was part of the ceremony. In one fluid motion, he gestured to Sophie and pointed toward the gap that had opened up near the front barriers. Sophie's face transformed, with surprise and joy. Her teacher, finally noticing the situation, quickly pushed the wheelchair toward the spot Davies had indicated. Within seconds, Sophie had a front-row view of the ceremony, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched the guards perform their ancient ritual. The timing was perfect. Davies was back in position before anyone in authority noticed his brief absence. The ceremony continued without interruption, but something magical had happened. Sophie's classmates, seeing her new vantage point, began to cheer and wave at the guards with even more enthusiasm. They seemed to understand that something special had occurred, that one of the soldiers had broken tradition to help their friend. The teachers exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing the extraordinary kindness they had just witnessed. After the ceremony concluded, Sophie raised her hand to wave goodbye to the guards. Davies, maintaining his stoic expression, allowed himself the smallest possible nod in her direction. It was barely noticeable to anyone not looking for it, but Sophie saw it and beamed with happiness. She had been acknowledged by a real Queen's Guard, treated not as someone to be pitied or overlooked, but as someone worthy of respect and consideration. The school group departed shortly afterward, but not before Ms. Patterson approached the guard station to express her gratitude. She didn't name Davies specifically, knowing that might cause trouble for him. But she made sure the commanding officers knew that their soldiers had demonstrated exceptional character and kindness. Her letter of commendation would eventually make its way up the chain of command, though the specific details of Davies' actions remained diplomatically vague. Word of the incident spread quietly among the guards, told in whispered conversations during shift changes and meal breaks. Davies became something of a hero to his fellow soldiers, not for breaking rules but for finding a way to serve with both perfect discipline and genuine compassion. His actions proved that being a Queen's Guard didn't require abandoning one's humanity. It required elevating it to its highest form. In the weeks that followed, other guards began to notice opportunities for similar acts of quiet kindness. They learned to read situations more carefully, to spot moments when a small gesture could make a significant difference in someone's experience. The rigid protocols remained unchanged, but the men behind the uniforms began to understand that true honor sometimes required creative interpretation of those rules. The summer heat was particularly intense on the day when Private Thomas Bennett faced what would become the most challenging moment of his young military career. At just 22 years old, Bennett was one of the newest members of the Queen's Guard, having completed his training only 6 months earlier. He took enormous pride in his position and was determined to prove himself worthy of the uniform he wore. Bennett was stationed at the front entrance of Buckingham Palace when he noticed a middle-aged man approaching with an unusual sense of purpose. Unlike typical tourists who came with cameras and excitement, this man walked with the heavy steps of someone carrying an enormous burden. He was well-dressed but disheveled, his suit wrinkled as if he had slept in it, and his eyes held a desperate quality that made Bennett instinctively alert. The man stopped directly in front of Bennett's post and began to speak in a voice that cracked with emotion. He introduced himself as David Morrison, a father from Scotland whose teenage son had taken his own life 2 weeks earlier. David had driven through the night to reach London, leaving behind a family in grief and a community struggling to understand the tragedy. He had come to the palace because his son, Jamie, had always dreamed of becoming a queen's guard. David's words came out in a rushing torrent of pain and regret. He told Bennett how Jamie had been fascinated by the guards since he was a small child, collecting books and memorabilia about their history and traditions. The boy had planned to apply for military service after finishing school, inspired by the discipline and honor he saw in the red-coated soldiers. Jamie's bedroom was still filled with pictures of the guards, his walls covered with photographs from family trips to London. As David continued to speak, Bennett felt his professional composure begin to crack. The grieving father described how Jamie had been struggling with depression and anxiety, conditions that the family had been trying to address with counseling and medication. Despite their efforts, Jamie had felt overwhelmed by the pressures of school and social expectations. On the night he died, he had been looking through his collection of Queen's Guard photographs, perhaps drawing some comfort from images of the soldiers he admired so much. David had brought something with him, a small toy soldier painted in the distinctive red uniform of the Queen's Guard. It had been Jamie's most treasured possession since childhood, a gift from his grandfather who had served in the military decades earlier. David held the toy soldier up for Bennett to see, his hand shaking as he explained that Jamie had clutched it during his final hours. The family had found it beside his bed, along with a letter expressing his admiration for the courage and dedication of the Queen's Guards. Bennett found himself facing an impossible situation. Every fiber of his training demanded that he remain motionless and silent, treating David like any other member of the public seeking attention from the guards. But the raw anguish in David's voice and the tragic story of young Jamie created a moral crisis that his military education had never prepared him to handle. How could he ignore a father's grief? How could he stand unmoved while a man poured out his heart about his lost child? The situation became even more complex when other tourists began to notice David's emotional state. Some people started taking pictures, treating his breakdown as an unusual spectacle to document and share on social media. A few visitors made inappropriate comments about the man bothering the guard or making a scene. Bennett felt his anger rising as he watched strangers turn David's moment of profound grief into entertainment. David seemed oblivious to the growing crowd around him. He continued speaking to Bennett as if they were alone, describing Jamie's dreams and ambitions, his kindness toward younger children, his struggles with fitting in at school. He talked about missed opportunities for family conversations, wondering if he could have said or done something different to save his son's life. The guilt and self-blame in his voice were heartbreaking to hear. As the afternoon wore on, David's emotional state began to deteriorate further. He started repeating himself, telling the same stories about Jamie over and over again. Bennett realized that the man was in the grip of overwhelming grief and possibly hadn't eaten or slept properly in days. Other palace staff had noticed the situation, but were unsure how to handle it without causing a scene that might reflect poorly on the institution. The turning point came when David suddenly swayed on his feet, appearing close to collapse. He had been standing in the hot sun for over an hour, talking nonstop while barely pausing to breathe. Bennett could see that the grieving father was on the verge of a physical breakdown to match his emotional state. In that moment, all thoughts of protocol and regulations disappeared from Bennett's mind. Moving with the same precision he used in ceremonial duties, Bennett made a series of subtle gestures that caught the attention of nearby palace staff. He used hand signals that were technically part of the guard's communication system, but applied them in a completely unauthorized way. Within minutes, a palace medical officer arrived on the scene, ostensibly to check on routine security matters, but actually responding to Bennett's silent call for help. The medical officer quickly assessed David's condition and determined that he needed immediate attention for dehydration and exhaustion. With Bennett's discreet guidance, the staff managed to escort David to a quiet area where he could rest and receive proper care. The transition was so smooth that most tourists didn't even realize what had happened. To them, it appeared as if palace security had simply followed normal procedures. Before David was led away, he pressed the small toy soldier into Bennett's hand. Through his tears, he whispered that Jamie would have wanted one of his heroes to have it, that it would mean everything to know that a real Queen's Guard would keep his memory alive. Bennett couldn't respond verbally, but he closed his fingers around the small figure and gave David the slightest nod of acknowledgement. The toy soldier remained hidden in Bennett's uniform for the rest of his shift, a small weight that reminded him of the responsibility he carried beyond mere ceremony and tradition. That evening, he wrote a letter to David's family, expressing his condolences and assuring them that Jamie's memory would be honored by those who shared his respect for duty and service. The letter was delivered through unofficial channels, ensuring that it couldn't be traced back to any breach of protocol. Word of Bennett's compassionate response spread quietly through the guards, joining the growing collection of stories about moments when humanity had triumphed over rigid adherence to rules. The young soldier had discovered that true strength sometimes required the courage to bend without breaking, to maintain discipline while embracing empathy. The autumn morning that would change everything for the Queen's Guard began like any other, with Lance Corporal Sarah Hughes taking her position at St. James's Palace. Hughes was one of the first women to serve as a Queen's Guard, having broken through years of tradition. When women were finally allowed to take on the role, she carried herself with extra determination, knowing that her performance would be scrutinized more closely than that of her male colleagues. At precisely 10:30 a.m., a black sedan pulled up to the palace gates, and two men in expensive suits stepped out, flanked by what appeared to be private security personnel. Hughes recognized them immediately from briefings and news reports. They were members of a foreign diplomatic delegation visiting London for important trade negotiations. The men walked with the confident stride of those accustomed to power and privilege, completely ignoring the ceremonial guards as they passed. Behind the official party, almost as an afterthought, walked a young woman who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. She wore a simple gray dress and kept her head down, her posture suggesting someone trying to make herself invisible. Hughes noticed immediately that the girl's wrists bore faint marks that looked like old bruises, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much trauma for her age. Every instinct Hughes possessed as both a soldier and a woman told her that something was terribly wrong. The diplomatic party was scheduled for a brief ceremonial visit, one of dozens of such events that took place at various royal residences throughout the year. They would tour certain areas of the palace, meet with minor officials, and participate in photographs that would demonstrate British hospitality toward visiting dignitaries. The entire event was planned to last no more than 2 hours, after which the delegation would return to their hotel. As the group moved through the palace corridors, Hughes maintained her position, but found ways to observe the young woman's behavior. The girl never spoke unless directly addressed, and when she did respond, her voice was barely above a whisper. She stayed as far from the men in suits as possible, while still being part of their group. Most disturbing of all, she flinched whenever anyone made sudden movements or raised their voices, even in normal conversation. During a pause in the tour, one of the diplomats made a comment in his native language that caused the girl to step backward in obvious fear. Hughes didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. The girl's eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape route, but the palace layout offered no obvious exits for someone unfamiliar with the building. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, signs that Hughes recognized from her military training as early indicators of a panic attack. Hughes faced an impossible dilemma. Her duty as a guard required her to remain at her post and maintain the ceremonial atmosphere that these diplomatic visits demanded. Any disruption could create an international incident, potentially damaging important trade relationships between Britain and the visiting nation, but her conscience as a human being couldn't ignore what appeared to be a young woman in serious distress, possibly being held against her will. The situation escalated when the girl tried to approach a palace window, seemingly drawn to the sunlight and open air. One of the diplomats immediately moved to block her path, speaking to her in harsh, rapid tones that made her shrink back in fear. The man's hand briefly touched her arm in what looked like guidance, but felt more like control. The girl's reaction confirmed Hughes's worst suspicions. This was not a willing participant in the diplomatic visit. Hughes began to think like a soldier planning a mission. She needed to assess the situation more thoroughly, identify potential allies, and determine the best course of action without compromising either the girl's safety or the diplomatic proceedings. She used her knowledge of the palace layout and security protocols to formulate a plan that would require perfect timing and complete trust from her fellow guards and palace staff. The breakthrough came when the diplomatic party was scheduled to view a particular portrait gallery that required them to split into two smaller groups due to space constraints. This separation would give Hughes the opportunity she needed, but only if she could coordinate with the right people at the right moment. She used the subtle communication system that guards had developed over the years, sending signals to her colleagues that indicated an urgent but discreet security concern. Sergeant Williams, who had been observing the visit from a distance, picked up on Hughes's signals and began to position himself strategically. He trusted Hughes's judgment completely, having worked with her long enough to know that she wouldn't break protocol without serious cause. Other guards and palace staff began to notice the subtle shift in alert status, preparing to respond to whatever situation was developing. The crucial moment arrived when the groups were transitioning between rooms. In the brief confusion of movement and reorganization, Hughes found herself positioned near the young woman. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make contact without being noticed by the diplomats or their security team. Using her body to shield the interaction from view, Hughes made eye contact with the girl and whispered a single question in English. "Do you need help?" The girl's response was immediate and heartbreaking. Without saying a word, she gave the smallest possible nod, her eyes filling with tears of relief at being acknowledged by someone who seemed to understand her situation. In that moment, Hughes knew with absolute certainty that she was looking at a victim of human trafficking, someone being moved through diplomatic channels under the protection of international immunity. Hughes made a decision that would end her military career but save a young woman's life. Using hand signals that appeared to be part of normal security procedures, she alerted palace staff to implement a rarely used emergency protocol designed for situations involving potential threats to visiting dignitaries. The protocol required the immediate but discreet involvement of specialized law enforcement officers who were trained to handle sensitive diplomatic situations. Within minutes, additional security personnel began to appear throughout the palace, ostensibly to provide enhanced protection for the diplomatic visit. In reality, these were undercover officers from units specializing in human trafficking cases. They had been briefed on the situation through secure communications and were prepared to take action the moment they could establish legal justification for intervention. The diplomatic party was politely informed that enhanced security measures were being implemented due to unspecified intelligence concerns. This explanation gave the officers time to observe the situation more closely and document evidence of the girl's distress and the men's controlling behavior. Everything had to be handled with extreme delicacy to avoid creating an international incident while still protecting the victim. Hughes maintained her ceremonial position throughout the operation, but her actions had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the girl's rescue and the exposure of a human trafficking network operating under diplomatic cover. The young woman would later identify Hughes as the person who had given her hope when she had almost given up on being saved. 6 months after the diplomatic incident, the lives of the Queen's Guards had changed in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Sarah Hughes had indeed faced a military tribunal for her actions, but instead of the court-martial she had expected, she received a commendation for exceptional service and courage under difficult circumstances. The young woman she had helped rescue had provided testimony that exposed a major human trafficking operation, leading to arrests across multiple countries and saving dozens of other victims. The ripple effects of these individual acts of compassion had created something unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard. What had begun as isolated moments of human kindness had evolved into an unofficial understanding among the guards that their highest duty was not just to tradition and ceremony, but to the protection and dignity of all people who came into their sphere of influence. The transformation was subtle but profound, invisible to casual observers but deeply felt by those who served. James Mitchell, The sergeant who had first questioned his rigid adherence to protocol after encountering young Emma had become an informal mentor to newer guards. He taught them that true strength lay not in the ability to ignore human suffering, but in finding ways to address it without compromising their professional responsibilities. His own encounter with Emma had ended on a positive note. The little girl's parents had worked through their difficulties and sent him a thank you card showing their family reunited and happy. Corporal Davies, who had helped Sophie see the changing of the guard ceremony, discovered that his actions had inspired changes far beyond that single moment. Sophie's school had been so moved by the guards' kindness that they had initiated a program to make their own events more accessible to students with disabilities. Davies received regular updates about Sophie's progress and her continued fascination with military history. She had announced her intention to join the Army when she grew up, inspired by soldiers who had shown her that strength and kindness could coexist. Thomas Bennett, the young private who had comforted the grieving father. David Morrison had maintained correspondence with the Morrison family throughout their healing process. The toy soldier that David had given him had become a reminder not just of young Jamie's lost dreams, but of the importance of recognizing when someone needed help. Bennett had quietly arranged for other guards to receive basic training in recognizing signs of mental health crises, ensuring that they could respond appropriately if they encountered similar situations. The changes weren't limited to individual guards. The entire culture of the regiment had shifted. Officers began to acknowledge privately that some of the most heroic actions taken by their soldiers had nothing to do with traditional military valor and everything to do with basic human decency. Training programs started to include discussions about balancing ceremonial duties with service to the community, recognizing that the Guards' role as symbols of British values included embodying compassion and justice. The transformation became most visible during a major state visit later that year. As international dignitaries and media representatives gathered at Buckingham Palace, the Queen's Guards performed their duties with the same precision and dignity they had always demonstrated. But careful observers noticed something different. A warmth in their bearing, an awareness of the people around them that hadn't existed before. They were still living symbols of tradition and discipline, but they had also become something more human and relatable. During that state visit, a moment occurred that would have been impossible under the old culture of rigid protocol. A small child in the crowd dropped her favorite stuffed animal, which was then accidentally kicked into the roadway where it was in danger of being trampled by the ceremonial horses. Without breaking formation or disrupting the parade, one of the guards managed to secure the toy and ensure its return to the tearful little girl. The action was so smooth and natural that most people assumed it was part of the planned ceremony. The media coverage of the state visit included several stories about the Queen's Guards that focused not just on their military precision, but on their evident care for the people around them. International newspapers wrote about British soldiers who managed to maintain centuries of tradition while adapting to modern sensibilities about service and humanity. The coverage helped cement a new image of the Queen's Guard as both guardians of heritage and protectors of human dignity. The most significant change came when the regiment's commanding officers formally acknowledged what had been happening informally for months. New guidelines were quietly distributed that gave guards more discretion in how they interpreted their duties, particularly when it came to situations involving public safety or genuine human need. The guidelines emphasized that maintaining dignity and composure didn't require complete emotional detachment, and that the best representatives of British values were those who could demonstrate both strength and compassion. Eleanor Hartwell, the elderly widow who had spoken to James about her late husband, returned to London for the anniversary of Robert's passing. This time, she was greeted not with stoic silence, but with a carefully orchestrated moment of recognition. As she approached, the same post where she had stood in the rain a year earlier, the guard on duty, one who had heard the story of her previous visit, performed a subtle but unmistakable gesture of acknowledgement. It was a small bow of the head, lasting barely a second, but it conveyed everything Eleanor needed to know about how her husband's legacy was being honored. The transformation of the Queen's Guard attracted attention from military units around the world. Delegations from other countries visited to observe how the British had managed to modernize their approach to ceremonial duties without sacrificing tradition or discipline. The guards found themselves serving as examples of how military organizations could evolve with the times while maintaining their core values and mission. Perhaps most importantly, the guards themselves reported higher job satisfaction and a deeper sense of purpose in their roles. They no longer felt like living statues going through empty motions, but rather like active participants in representing the best qualities of their nation. Recruitment became easier as word spread that serving as a Queen's Guard meant joining an organization that valued both excellence and humanity. The story of their transformation became a teaching example in military academies and leadership programs around the world. It demonstrated that discipline and compassion weren't opposing forces, but complementary strengths that could work together to achieve something greater than either could accomplish alone. The Queen's Guards had proven that tradition could be honored not by refusing to change, but by ensuring that change served the highest ideals that tradition was meant to protect. As the seasons changed and new guards joined the ranks, the culture of compassionate service continued to grow and evolve. Each new member learned not just the ceremonial procedures and military protocols, but also the unwritten code of looking out for those around them. The red tunics and bearskin hats remained the same, but the men and women who wore them had become something their predecessors never imagined possible, symbols of strength who weren't afraid to show their hearts. The legacy of those first brave guards who chose humanity over rigid protocol had created something lasting and beautiful. They had proven that true honor wasn't about perfect adherence to rules, but about using those rules to serve something greater than themselves. In breaking their Stoic act, they had revealed not weakness but the greatest strength of all, the courage to care for others, even at personal cost. Their story continues today, as each new generation of Queen's Guards learns that their highest calling isn't to be perfect soldiers, but to be perfect servants of the people they protect. They stand watch not just over palaces and ceremonies, but over the ideals of justice, compassion, and human dignity that make their service meaningful. In the end, they discovered that the most surprising act of all was simply choosing to be human while wearing the uniform of legends.